Hello, Mr. Stromberg here. Thanks for paying attention again today. We're going to talk again about artists in modern art and three huge personalities, very important figures in art today. Here they are right in front of you. The first is Frida Kahlo, the second is Georgia O'Keeffe, and the third is Jackson Pollock. We'll get the chance to explore each of these artists and see a pretty different take on uh, on art today. They're all doing fairly different things. Remember, in modern art, like top branches of a tree, everything is splintering off into its own directions, and artists exploring all kinds of things now. Last time we looked at minimal art, we looked at abstraction, expressionism, psychological art, surrealism with Salvador Dali. We'll come back to that today. So, again, this next generation of artists here doing a lot of interesting things that we'll talk about today. So let's get going. The first is Frida Kahlo, Chalo, Kahlo, Frida Kahlo. And this is called The Two Fridas. Okay, this is the slide you should know. The Two Fridas. Very peculiar painting, kind of a disturbing painting the more you look at the imagery of it. Frida Kahlo is a very famous figure in the history of art. You may have seen her likeness um, in pop culture. I mean, she shows up all the time, and she's someone who's grown, I think, even more famous. All these many years after her death. I think she died in the '50s sometime. Um, uh, Mainly because her art is just so brutally honest, and there's something deep about it that connects to people. I think the best way to think about Frida's art is to think of it as if you are opening somebody's diary, somebody who's lived a life of real pain and hardship, and you are looking at all of their deepest, darkest fears and secrets, and they are being completely, totally honest with you. That's kind of how she paints. And she uses the language of surrealism, again, doing something that wouldn't physically be possible in the world in order to, in this case, I think, deal with her own um, tragic past, which I'll talk about here, and all that she dealt with. She had a really awful life. So here we see two versions of Frida in two different gowns here, and you can see that their hearts are connected through this hovering artery or vein that goes between the two, that it's been severed from down below. Anyway, what's it getting at here? Well, there are two different versions of Frida, right? The heart that's beating, the heart that's failing, and they both stare at us, with this iconic Frida face with this huge unibrow. It was a way for her to wrestle with her own personal troubles, and I think a kind of therapy to deal with it. So let's talk a little bit about Frida here. Here she is in a one of many photos, the first kind of color photo we've seen in a while here. I guess I showed you a color photo of Picasso earlier, but here she is. Um, and you can see that, yeah, she had this huge unibrow, which she very much cultivated, and that became kind of, a key look to her. And she would wear these elaborate floral arrangements in her hair, and was known, as a real fashion. She's become a real fashion icon in art for many reasons here. Frida is from Mexico. Okay, so we've not talked about Mexican art yet. It's because she's a giant of Mexican art, and coincidentally married at the time to the most important of Mexican painters. So here they are. Here's Frida. This is an early picture of hers here, called Me and Diego. So here she is um, in her red shawl here, holding hands with Diego Rivera. Diego Rivera was her husband, and they were married off and on. I think they were married two different times, and they had a tumultuous relationship. Diego Rivera, extremely successful, popular, European trained. He studied in Europe and was a contemporary of Picasso. Actually, painted Cubist paintings for a while. Anyway, traveled back and forth from Europe to Mexico in the early 1900s, and he's famous for murals. So enormous, brightly colored, gorgeously painted murals that he painted in Italian fresco style. He was the most famous artist in Mexico, and it was only natural that as Frida gained notoriety as well, that the two of them would become something of a power couple. And they did. They were married for a long time. However, Diego Rivera, total womanizer, cheated on her all the time, was a pretty bad husband. And, as if her life wasn't difficult enough, she had to, go through some pretty awful situations with him. So let's look at the way that she uses art, again, to deal with her own personal pain. Some of her images can be disturbing to look at, like this next one, for example. This is called The Broken Column. Very famous image here. Um, so here's what happened to Frida. When she was young, I can't remember exactly how old she was, but late teens, early 20s, she was in a horrific streetcar accident. So she was on a streetcar, which is like a, electrified trolley, basically, and it had a collision, and she was thrown across the streetcar. And what happened was a handrail in the streetcar impaled her abdomen and came out the other side. As a result, she had lifelong pain and injury from it, back injury, pain. Um, Later on, she was never able to have a child, which was something she desperately wanted to do because of that accident. It hindered her ability to her reproductive organs to work in her abdomen, and so she could not. She suffered a series of miscarriages every time she would try to conceive a child. She couldn't do it, and that, of course, only led to her own, the just the sadness, never-ending sadness for Frida of what she had to deal with. So here in The Broken Column, she's showing us here, kind of laid bare, completely honest with us, in this very awkward nude portrait. But then she also, if you look, there are little pins sticking into her skin all over the place. You have this back brace, and look at her spine. You can actually see through her torso to her spine, and it is a classical column there that's been crumbled. So, this is a way of her trying to make her pain, her physical pain, her lifelong physical pain, visible through her art. Psychologically, of course, she was, just imagine the psychological fallout of having debilitating pain your entire life, but also the pain of being deeply in love with someone and having that person treat you like garbage. And that's what Diego Rivera did. So here you can see, this piece, Diego on My Mind. So where Diego is literally on her mind, right? His face is on top of her eyebrows, and you can see tears coming out of her eyes there. This one has always been one of my favorite. It's called The Little Deer. You can see 1946 down there at the bottom. But The Little Deer, what a crazy surrealist picture here. Here we have this deer with Frida's head, but antlers coming out of the top, and it's been shot through with all these arrows. I mean, this is just, imagine her in a particularly lonely day, feeling as if, she's under attack, and she goes ahead and paints this. I was shocked to actually see this painting in person. They had a huge traveling show of Frida Kahlo's work in the mid 2000s, and it was a big show at the Walker Art Center, somewhat of a retrospective, and they had a ton of her paintings there. It was really cool. And this one was there, and I was to come around. It's a painting I'd always been aware of and had seen, but it is so tiny, probably smaller than a piece of printer paper. Super, super small. And some of her work is quite small. The Two Fridas is one of the larger paintings I saw of hers, but a lot of these are painted, exquisitely on a very small scale with very, very tiny brushes and detail. Obviously, the repeating motif is her. It's her own self-portrait. And here we have another one. They're dreamscapes, nightmarescapes. Things happen that make you uncomfortable and really are quite odd. Here she's actually surrounded by these desert plants and this weird kind of Mother Earth figure behind there. She's actually cradling Diego there, who's naked and in like a baby position. So, what is he? He's the big baby. She's the one, just imagine her after a particularly horrible argument, being mad at him for being the big baby and having to, hold everything together here. I mean, that's the kind of thing that I get from this picture. I think part of the reason why her artwork is just means so much to people now is that it's just so honest, and it's deep. And the more you know about her story, the more tragic it is, and I think the more appealing it is because it's just so real. One of the crazy things that happened to Frida was that as she got older, um, she the, the the back injury and the pains that she had, it just left her in horrific pain all the time, so that she really had trouble getting out of bed. And so she laid in bed and had this huge easel. Some people helped her construct an easel over the top of her bed so that she could lay on her bed and paint, above her rather than having to sit up in the bed. She could actually paint looking up. Here we have, what can only be described as this, horror scene of just all this random meat, dead things, right, just being funneled into her mouth. I mean, here she is in this bed, in this sickly, kind of strange, surrealist landscape here with not a lot of hope, and just she's being fed death, right? That's so. This is this is again a very real way of her just dealing with what she's having to work through here. And she painted at the end of her life some of her most incredible and vulnerable works in uh, basically just laying on her back in a bed. So, here's a huge scene that has so many different figures, political figures, religious figures. Uh, in there, you can see Egyptian figures, and there's Gandhi and Jesus, and allusion to Moses at the bottom. I mean, this is kind of like a, what's the meaning of life type image here. You can see in the center kind of the image of a fetus in a uterus there. I mean, again, she suffered her whole life from this terrible loneliness of wanting to have a child, and all these miscarriages and never being able to have one. If you look, there's two white orbs. On one side, you see sperm and an egg there, and then on the left side, that's a cell that's dividing. So, there's science and religion, symbols colliding here, all in this strange scene up at the very top, Mexican um, uh, art up there at the top. So in all, these dazzling colors. It's not art that makes you particularly comfortable, is it? It's art that is difficult to look at, but is unquestionably deep and really, really interesting, because it's like someone's developed a way to tell us a really, really deep story or express an incredibly deep thought that they're having through the use of surreal images here. Things that would have no other reason to go together, but here they seem to work. Here's a photo of Frida towards the end of her life here. And you can see this apparatus that they've put up over top of her head here so that she can work. And they've actually had, they have a cloth thing around her chin and her head here to help, stabilize neck pain so that she can raise her arm to work. So, boy, I mean, as I'm telling you this here, I'm just sort of, trying to find ways to not make it such a downer, but it is a real downer. Like, she lived a really hard life, and that is absolutely the reason why her artwork connects with people. Like I said, it's raw, it's honest, it's real, and she was someone who just poured every single bit of herself into her paintings. And today, she's as famous as she has ever been, and she continues, to be just an icon of modern art. So there you go, Frida Kahlo, the two Fridas. All right. So here we go, another kind of giant of modern art throughout the 20th century here. So this is Georgia O'Keeffe. Georgia O'Keeffe. O'Keeffe is O''K''E''F''E. O'Keeffe. The name of this piece is Red Poppies. Red Poppies. Georgia O'Keeffe lived an extremely long life. I think she was close to 100 years old when she died in the 1970s. And so to think of all that she experienced and lived through in her time, it's pretty amazing. Here she is as a younger woman. She was married and working in New York City, and married to a photographer named Alfred Stieglitz. And Alfred Stieglitz he's the most famous and kind of important of early American photographers. He was quite a bit older than she was and died, quite a bit before she did. But the two of them were married, so this is a photo that Alfred Stieglitz took of her. And he took some of the very famous photographs of New York City in the late 1800s, at a time when photography was being seen as an art form, not just this um, uh, magic process that captures time, but actually a way to um, capture time in a way that was visually as interesting as a work of art. Photography became really important, and so the two of them were married, and another power couple, artist couple in New York City. Georgia O'Keeffe's strength is embracing an abstraction that is also very real. So Frida does surrealism, but a deeply personal kind of surreal art. Georgia O'Keeffe paints things that, if we look back at Red Poppies here, um, obviously from the title, she's telling us that it's two red poppies, okay, or two flowers up close here. But you can also, if you see it purely for the fields of color and the shapes presented here, it's a beautifully abstract painting, and it could give allusions to a lot of things, like two explosions or, um, two dark sun type forms or two fires. There's a lot of movement and life and energy to these paintings, and the fact that you can zoom in and crop something in such a way like a flower so that it can appear to be abstracted but also quite realistic is an interesting take. And there are other artists who are going to do this after her, but that's her thing. So she has a few different flowers are the main thing she does. We'll look at quite a bit of those, but architecture as well is really important. So here we have a building in New York City, and if you crane your head and look a little close at it, you'll see that she doesn't really paint the building at all. She just paints the shapes that she sees. So the shapes of the windows in the skyscraper here at night, or the shapes of the steam coming out of the top of the building there, or the searchlight in the sky. And funny how, when you get the shapes correct and you get them all precisely put next to each other and the colors are correct, um, it appears to be pretty real at the same time as it's just a bunch of squares put together. So, that balance between something that can be abstract and real is uh, it's a pretty fine line sometimes. So sometimes, with the buildings, they do look fairly real and fairly straightforward. And certain flowers as well. We'll go quick through some of these here, but you'll definitely be able to tell what they are. So yeah, the flower, okay, zooming way in, and depending on the flower, you get different takes on what the flower can allude to, what it can feel like, the way that the colors can work emotionally. We've talked about the emotional connection of color back through the Post-Impressionists and the Impressionists. That's very much continuing. In art at this time, so this is, the 20s through the 40s, basically, mid 40s, late, early 50s, I guess. So that 30-year period. This is the time, and we'll talk with our next artist, when abstraction is very much the norm. All of a sudden, abstract art in modern art has become the main deal. We looked at Mondrian last time, working with a sort of simplified art, okay, or minimal abstraction, but a lot of the painters working in New York at this time were working um, uh, in purely abstract art, and so abstract paintings. And so George O'Keeffe always kind of walking that line between abstraction and realism, trying to find a way that they can be both. So it can feel like a flower, but also it's a very odd abstracted painting as well. If you look at this one, yeah, it definitely looks like a flower, but it also looks very alien and different from other flowers that we've seen too. So here we go, a few others here. Sometimes, and I'm a big fan of these later flower ones she did, they're really zoomed in. They feel very fluid, very like there's a lot of motion to them, and obviously emotional reaction to color as well. And they're just beautifully painted. So, abstracted works. I always like this one because I feel like it looks like a fire shooting out of a volcano or something. Anyway, the flower zoomed in, realistic and abstract at the same time. Another motif she plays with all the time. So there's architecture, there's also flowers, of course, and bones. Bones are a big one. Eventually, after her much older husband, Alfred Stieglitz, passed away, she wanted to get out of New York City for good. New York City, just too crazy a place to be and to live after all those years. And so she purchased a ranch in New Mexico, and she moved to New Mexico. So there are some films of her at the end of her life where literally she did this every day until the last days of her life. She would get up, at dawn and walk out into the desert and collect animal bones and interesting rocks and make paintings like this one. What you're actually seeing is a fragment of sky through the eye socket in a skull is what you're seeing right here. So it has this. It's obviously a very abstracted painting, but also from a particular point of view, a quite realistic view as well. Here's one a little more straightforward, a horse skull here against a piece of fabric. Sometimes her works do get a little bit surreal. So here we have I guess a ram's skull here and a flower kind of floating over this New Mexico landscape. And then finally, you could look at, again, her enduring interest in architectural forms as just shapes and the way that shapes interact with each other to create work that could feel abstracted but also recognizable. So here you have a little church here. This is this Southwest kind of architecture that they make with dried mud with those rounded corners there. So you can see it's a that kind of New Mexico Native American style of architecture. So there you go, Georgia O'Keeffe. Worked for a really long time. Again, also quite famous and appreciated today in art. And the idea that something can be real and abstract at the same time, depending on your point of view. All right, moving on to our final artist here for today. This is Jackson Pollock. Jackson Pollock. Pollock is Pollock. Jackson Pollock. And the name of this piece is Lavender Mist. Lavender Mist. There's nothing about the piece that alludes much to that title. And as you'll see, that's sort of the idea here. We're moving into an area here called non-objective art. This is art that can be tricky to comprehend and understand, but it's monumentally important. There are many people who believe that Jackson Pollock is up there with Picasso as probably the most important artist of the 20th century because in a lot of ways he made the biggest contribution to art in the modern age, and that he was the first to banish the object altogether and indeed the way of actually applying the paint. So there were other abstract artists who were just painting for the point of paint, but they were still touching their paintbrushes to the canvas. Jackson Pollock is the first to do this radical new kind of painting, which is a drip painting. So if you know of Jackson Pollock, you know that this is all splattered on here. We'll come back to Lavender Mist in a moment here. Here's a very famous photograph of Jackson Pollock at work in the 1940s here, mid-40s, in his studio, and you can see how he works here. So Jackson Pollock discovered that there were a lot of other things that painting could do rather than just show you an object or make you feel something. What if paint could actually harness pure energy and motion and feeling, in the way that it's applied? And so to do that, he started not actually touching the paintbrush to the surface, but rolling these enormous pieces of canvas out on the floor. It's kind of hard to express how big these are. Sometimes they are movie screen size. They're really, really big. And to see them, you have to usually go to New York City because a lot of them were commissioned for places in New York. So if you go there, you can see quite a few of them. But huge. Roll out the canvas on the ground, and then he would put on jazz records, and then he would basically just, through these marathon sessions without stopping to eat, basically, 20 hours in a row type sessions, just dance around the thing, trying to harness the feeling of the music. He was big into that kind of swing and jazz music of the 1940s, that boogie woogie music that we talked about with Mondrian. And he would just, allow what he felt to kind of control the way that he moved his arm and thwacked the painting or thwacked the paint off of the whatever he was splattering with and onto the surface to kind of capture the feeling or motion of the paint. That was the idea. Now, he oftentimes didn't even use brushes. Sometimes he used sticks. Sometimes he used spatulas. Sometimes he used any random tool that could dip in there that would control or give him a different kind of a drip. You know, one tool is going to give a real fine drip. One might give a big old um, fat, heavy pooling of paint on the surface. So he would use whatever he could. He also did not use high quality artist paint to do this. He would use, for the first time here, regular kind of cheap, accessible material. So like the kind of paint you can get from the hardware store. And sometimes it's latex-based paint or, water-based paint that can be uh, cleaned up with water coming into contact with oil-based paint or metallic enamel, the kind you use to paint a motorcycle, for example. So if you look really, really close at these, you get this crazy little areas where like oil-based paint and water-based paint have mixed and give you these little swirls. And it's fascinating painting to look at. They are super, super deep and dense. Now, a lot of people, when they learn on the surface about Jackson Pollock, this work, like Mondrian, tends to make them mad because the first thing they will say is, "How is that art? I can do that." Pollock paintings routinely will sell for, when they do come to auction, which is not very often, but when they do, it's a rare thing, and they'll sell in excess of $100 million today. They're incredibly valuable, and yet people will say, "How is that art? I could go out to my garage right now and I could, just find paint and whack it on the ground." And well, certainly part of that is true. You might be able to do some of this, but again, what it represents this time period, that you could actually liberate paint from that careful type of painting altogether, that instead paint itself could harness energy and feeling and motion and not actually show you an object at all. That's a completely different way of thinking about it. And it just, in an age when Picasso had done it so many times and was now getting old, Pollock kind of showed up, and this painting did it again, turned art on its head. So I get ahead of myself a little bit here. Let's look at some other pictures. This is a very small detail here, okay, of a Pollock picture. So talking like 4 or 5 inches across here of a movie screen size painting. So you get the idea of how dense they were. He actually was resistant to the whole idea that his art was random in any way. He didn't believe that he was just throwing something randomly. And there are painters who have done that, who've just taken a canvas and just hucked a bucket of paint in the air and let it fall, and that's their work, right? That was not Pollock. He was not random. He was very intentional about where he was doing the little drips and where he felt that certain areas needed to be more complicated or more left open, or where it needed to blend or bleed more, where it needed to be darker, lighter. That's why he would, pour every bit of himself, no pun intended, into these pictures. Here's an actual detail of lavender mist. So, part of the fascination of seeing them in person is that you stand in front of them and you don't get any of this from seeing the slide version of it. Go to New York, go to the Museum of Modern Art, stand in front of lavender mist, and just allow it to fill your entire field of vision. And it's impossible to stare at it and not feel that sense of violence and anger, almost to the way that the paint is thrown down. Like you feel the motion and energy of the paint, and it almost feels alive and pulsates in front of your eyes. It is a very strange optical effect, but also it becomes this endlessly fascinating web to stare at. Just look at this detail here from Lavender Mist, which again, this is only a couple inches across on an enormous canvas here, and try to figure out which paint is first. Was it the black first, the blue, the white, the brown? Which one? It's actually kind of hard to tell. As soon as you think that you have it figured out, then you realize that one color is in front of another one, or they blended in such a way that, maybe it's not that way. It's very odd, and that it's almost like this tangled web that your eyes want to try to make sense of and figure out. Another thing that Pollock did was he did not prime his canvases. What painters do before they paint on a piece of canvas is they put a base coat of gesso or just white basically over the canvas, and what that does is it soaks into the fabric, and when it dries it gives you this perfectly stiff layer that is not going to soak in the paint and make it soft on the edge. In other words, if you just paint on regular canvas, like if you're just painting on your jeans or something, part of it soaks through to the other side. So you would want to prime it first. That's what cloth does. Well, Pollock intentionally didn't do that. So when he threw the paintings down, sometimes you get these hard edges where the paint has pooled, but then you also get these really weird, soft, kind of vague areas where it's gone. It's actually soaked in, almost like he's painted on a sponge in a few areas. So very strange. Now, to those who would say that Pollock, didn't know what he was doing as an artist, he was a bad artist, and that's why you just figured this out. He actually was a struggling artist for decades. Of all places, he was from um, uh, Wyoming, and somehow made his way to New York City and studied with the most well-respected uh, realist painter in the early 1900s. Thomas Hart Benton was his name. Pretty amazing that that was his teacher, because their work could be more different. But eventually fell in line with this group of abstract artists I was talking about, who were working, from the 20s into the 40s here. And this is the kind of work he was making. If you look close at it, you can get a sense of a little bit of Picasso there with some of those shapes. Lots of times he's just squirting color right out of the tube to draw these lines. But he was not having a lot of success with these, not selling a lot. And he was also really struggling. Pollock was his entire life prone to alcoholism. He was a raging alcoholic. Um, there are, he's found, sleeping on the street, basically passed out on the street. He had problems with alcohol. And so it wasn't until he met another artist, who unfortunately we don't have the time to talk about, but another great abstract artist. Her name was Lee Krasner, great painter herself, and they were married. And she realized she had to get Jackson out of New York City, had to get him to a place where he wouldn't be tempted to drink anymore, where he could just pour himself into his art. And so they moved out to Long Island, in New York, outside of the city, um, an hour's drive or so. And they bought this farmhouse, which is still there today. You can visit it. You can actually go into his studio where the famous photograph I showed you earlier was taken, and you can see, there's just paint splatter dried all over the edge of the room, and all his cans of paint are there, all stiff and hard with the brushes still in them. A pretty cool place to visit. And it was there where he, stumbled upon this idea of the drip. And so here's Lavender Mist again. Now, there are a lot of these paintings that he made. There was this huge feature in Life magazine, which kind of solidified him as this overnight sensation genius, who'd stumbled upon something amazing. If you go on YouTube and look for Jackson Pollock video, you'll actually see there's some very clever videos they did where they put a camera behind a piece of glass and had him, drip on top of the glass, so you get the view of what you would look like if you were the surface, right? Pretty clever. And there are interviews with him, and it was one of these crazy situations where overnight he went from being a struggling artist to somebody who had like flipped the art world on its head. Here's a famous one called Blue Poles. Again, really, really difficult to appreciate it unless you can see it in person. It's enormous, and so many little splatters, and it's just harnessed pure energy in all its ways. Here's another one. If you look towards the top there, there's that orange and white splatter there. Here's a detail of that, and so you can get a sense just for how thick and extensive the abstraction is, and just kind of fascinating to look at. It's the more you look at it, the deeper it goes. A few others here. This is part of a movement in art that's called abstract expressionism. Here's another detail, one of my favorite Pollock details here, where you can see, again, just try to untangle with your eyes the web here, figure out which color goes first and how he would have done this. It's endlessly fascinating to look at, and also very violent and just filled with feeling, the way that the paint has been dripped down. This group of artists who were painting in the 30s and 40s and into the early 50s called themselves the Abstract Expressionists, and there was a lot of these famous painters, and they were all friends in New York City. Remember, after World War II, all these painters, the art world was centered in Paris, and during World War II, a lot of those painters had to flee, and so New York City pretty much became the place where art took off in the latter half of the 20th century. And so he was friends with a lot of these painters like Willem de Kooning, Mark Rothko, um, others that you may have heard of that we won't have the time to talk about. But really, what they believed is that art had kind of exhausted itself by the 1940s, right? There was really, if you take any object, any particular scene, any particular genre of painting, really, to some extent, they sort of believed that it had all been done. The only thing left to do was to paint itself, right? Allow paint and the way it's put down to be the future of art. And so they sort of banished the object altogether and said there is no object, there's only paint, there's only feeling. Pollock famously said that, I want to paint, nature. I just want to paint, get to the core of who I am as a person. Paint human nature as paint. That's what it is. So it's wrong to look at a Pollock painting and say you see a tree or you see a face or whatever. Like, no, you just see paint. That's what it's supposed to be. And that can be difficult to understand. So anyway, mid 40s, Pollock became super famous overnight. His work started selling for enormous sums of money. He had commissions all over the place and, was seen as this guy who had really just turned art on its head once again and charted a whole new path forward for art. And the tragic story of Pollock is that in the confusion of his fame and how he was supposed to deal with all that pressure, he relapsed into his drinking and very predictably died in a drunk driving accident in, I think, 1956. Did not make as much work. And certainly it's an instance where, you think of your celebrity who's died young and all of a sudden the way that you remember them, is forever altered by the fact that they died a tragic death and you don't really know what they could have made. And if anything, that's only increased the value for his work nowadays. In any case, there's Jackson Pollock. And Lavender Mist, again, is the name of the piece. So for today, again, Frida Kahlo, two Fridas, using the language of surrealism and a deep personal, almost uncomfortably personal look at the pain in her life. We have Georgia O'Keeffe and Two Poppies here, and she's, or Red Poppies, sorry, and she's creating art that is both abstract and realistic at the same time, depending on your point of view. And we have Jackson Pollock, Lavender Mist, creating work that is non-objective art. That is, there is no object at all. The point of the painting is the paint, and in this case, the emotional, dripping feel. Trying to harness pure feeling, human feeling, in the way that the paint is thrown down on the surface. All three of these really revolutionary ways to think about what art can do, and challenging the notion of what art is. So there you go. Next time we will finish up with our final artist, and then we'll talk a little bit about where art is up to today. Take care.